You've all read the title. I'm about to open a can of worms that cannot be resealed. I acknowledge the criticism I'm now opening myself up to. I suppose I just have to own that. I take issue with many of the choices made with the Disney Star Wars sequels. I think most of it could have been avoided with just a little planning. While it's too late for that now, I would like to pitch a pre-sequel trilogy acting as a new episode 7 to 9 that allows everything to remain canon, but hopefully adding to the story in a way that makes it all feel a little more well-rounded and complete. How's it going, guys? My name's Graham and welcome to Two Left Frames. Allow me to shoot first here and say that I don't intend to change people's minds or convince them of my own opinions. I also plan to keep the forced puns and references to a minimum. It's a little too cringe, maybe. Regardless of what you think of these movies, I hope you can enjoy the process of trying to map out a new trilogy within an existing framework. I would love if you refuted, rewrote, added to, or deleted anything I choose to include in this video. It's all for fun, and I think anyone should be welcome to throw their hat into the ring. Is that a mixed metaphor? To throw your cat into the comfy blanket. Everyone start throwing your cats. Let me lay bare some general Star Wars opinions I have. Let's rip that band-aid made of opinions right off and go from there. The original trilogy is the best trilogy in Star Wars, hands down, no contest. The prequel trilogy, hello there, has some neat ideas and characters, and is wrapped up in my brain with some serious childhood nostalgia, but at the end of the day, I don't think they're very good. Episode 3 is decent, but even it has major issues. I can barely rewatch these now. The sequel trilogy is a train wreck as well. The Force Awakens was fun probably twice, but really hasn't held up for me beyond that. The Last Jedi might be one of the all-time best Star Wars movies, despite some horrid flaws that nearly ruin it. Like, a major example is Finn going all suicide at the end, and then Rose going suicide in an effort to save him. Then for some reason they have a kiss, and then both make it back to safety. That's the sort of stuff I dislike. I'm totally on board with loner reclusive Luke Skywalker. And boy oh boy, I'd love me some of that green milk. Yum yum. And The Rise of Skywalker may be one of the worst Star Wars movies of all time. So the sequels are a mixed bag that end with a baby Ewok's whimper. Hey, while we're at it, Rogue One was pretty great, and I genuinely enjoyed Solo. Both have issues, both are among the better Star Wars movies Disney has made. To me, one of the most beloved franchises of all time feels broken, inconsistent, and is at risk of having its legacy damaged beyond repair. Almost any other series in history would have already folded and probably rebooted after 4 decades of this treatment. But Star Wars was long ago elevated beyond that, and endures in spite of itself. There is almost no Star Wars opinion that can be held at this point that won't be seen as controversial. Even statements like, the original Star Wars trilogy is the best trilogy, is going to have its detractors. I made that comment 2 minutes ago, and at least one person left a lengthy hate comment and stopped watching. This franchise is near and dear to so many people, who are all drawn to separate elements of it and expect something different. Honestly, it feels like George Lucas himself valued different parts of it over time, and Disney changed that yet again. Within and outside of Lucas's influence, the 9-episode saga barely feels cohesive. If it weren't for common elements like the Force and lightsabers and cool sound effects tying it together, these movies share almost nothing in terms of structure or tone. I in no way expect to please everyone with this video, and I imagine it will instead piss many off. There is this concept that in human history, through billions of decks of cards and billions of individual people collectively shuffling those decks of cards upwards of trillions of times, statistically speaking, the same order of 52 cards has never existed twice. I just realized I just shuffled the jokers in here. I gotta pick out the rule cards. The point being, I think it's essentially as unlikely that 2 people on the planet share identical opinions on Star Wars. I'm not out here to please everyone. In fact, I'm not really out here to please anyone. But this is a video idea that's been cooking in my brain for about 2 years now. I think it would be fun for myself. I hope it opens up some interesting conversations I'm excited to see where it goes, and so I figured what the hell, I'll put it out there and see how it goes. I made an entire video on the planning of series in general, with Star Wars at the center of that conversation. I think they had the opportunity to do something great with the sequel trilogy, and they totally blew it. New characters ushered in by the old? That's great. Expanding the universe to reach beyond the Skywalker and Palpatine names? Great. But then they also kind of just failed to do that anyways? Not so great. Refusing to break free of that nostalgia, battling with its own identity, doubling back on new concepts and ideas, adding and removing characters willy-nilly, ignoring your own characters' arcs, mixed tones and themes, forcing continuity in ways that does nothing but break series continuity, and bumbling through 3 movies that lead nowhere? Far less than great. I hated Rise of Skywalker so much. My response was to immediately try to rinse that taste from my mouth and the entirety of my brain by reaching for anything else within that universe to sink into. I've been reading a lot of audiobooks the last few years and decided to pick up Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy. It seemed to come most highly recommended. The books aren't perfect, with the first one by far being the best of the 3, but the narration is fantastic, with near exact impressions of Luke and Han really carrying the whole thing. His Lando's pretty good as well, and he gives some original characters some pretty great voices along the way. Talon Karrde really stands out. If you are looking for some new, high-quality Star Wars content that's not really canon, but adheres close enough to the established canon to be almost indistinguishable, then I highly recommend this audiobook series for that full experience. It fits nicely in between episodes 6 and 7, and if Disney never does anything with that time period, we can all just pretend that this is what was going on. What this series did for me is make me realize how much story there is left to be told between the events of episodes 6 and 7. I think we were all so excited about the announcement of a new trilogy starting with The Force Awakens that we didn't really think about the fact that we were overwriting so much potential Star Wars history. But there was really no way to do that without a brand new cast. I mean, they kind of did a new cast, but not really. Disney didn't spend $4 billion on Lucasfilms to start from scratch. Obviously, they needed to pull from some of that existing lore. Their safest bet was to quickly turn around something nostalgic that made use of that original cast. But that massive time skip kind of leaves the viewers in the lurch. The writers kind of worked to fill in those blanks, but did so haphazardly, committing themselves fully to this new continuity that had to persist for at least 3 movies, if not a larger franchise filled with spin-offs, and they probably should have taken a bit longer to map that out. The idea that came to form in my mind is that Star Wars, and specifically the Skywalker Saga, desperately needs a set of movies that take place in this time period, following along with a young Luke, Han, and Leia. I plan to lift heavily from those Thrawn novels to outline specific storylines I think are needed to fill in some of the plot holes the sequels created. Even some of the plot holes that take place within those 3 movies. I don't know how they got that wrong. I also hope that it would serve some very specific storytelling and movie-making functions. Here's one example of that. The original and sequel trilogies tell the same story of empires, rebellions, and Death Stars. The Force Awakens has been heavily criticized for this repetition. This left Rian Johnson with the task of then either remaking The Empire Strikes Back or blowing up that whole concept, which is the option he did choose. Episode 7 negated the feeling of victory after 6. That reset to being on the losing side happened off-screen. A pre-sequel trilogy could use a new template to break up that pattern if watching the movies chronologically. Back off the Death Stars for just a minute. Or what about the nostalgia bait of bringing back the original cast in the sequels? That was a wonderful treat for people who had waited 30 years to check back in with Luke, Leia, and Han. But it doesn't really matter moving forward. They boil down to cameos mostly, and act as a send-off to characters we now barely know anymore. They've clearly all changed so much in the interim. It would be kind of unrealistic if they remained the static same people they were 3 decades prior. So what if a pre-sequel trilogy had an entirely new cast playing these iconic roles? We could see new interpretations, flesh out these characters even further, and with them on a trajectory that leads into episode Episode 7 and give us a legitimate long-term reason to be excited to see the roles reprised by their original actors. That worked once on release day, after everyone was left waiting with a 30-year gap. But from this point on, to any franchise newcomers, they'll no longer have the payoff of that multi-decade wait. Subbing in new actors means the eventual return of Hamill, Fisher, and Ford will always mean something. It's not just nostalgia for someone who's been following along with Star Wars their entire life, it's a within-series payoff that anyone can enjoy. While the original performances extend well beyond iconic, with Mark Hamill wholly embodying everything that is Luke Skywalker, and being one of the most all-around decent human beings to maybe ever walk this earth, maybe there is such a thing as a non-controversial Star Wars statement. I don't think these characters should never be allowed to be reinterpreted. Well, hopefully I had you all on the same page for 2 seconds there. There is no point recasting Tony Stark, because we saw the entirety of his time as Iron Man from beginning to end. There's nothing left to tell there, we don't need to revisit it. New actors can play new Iron Men, but never a new Tony Stark. Whereas we have so many decades of these characters' lives unaccounted for. I love Mark Hamill to pieces, but are we never allowed to explore that time of Luke's life ever again? I would love an excuse to see more of that. Not just a cameo, I want to see 3 new movies of Luke. Was Alden Ehrenreich's portrayal of Han as good as Harrison Ford? Hard no. But I respect the hell out of that actor for daring to do more than an impression. I already know I love Donald Glover, but his impression of Lando was stilted. He should have been trying to do something new and original with the character and make it his own, and I think the performance suffered for that. We have had many movies and decades to appreciate Ford ad nauseum, both as Han and otherwise. This guy had one movie wrought with horrible production issues to prove his worth, and I still think he brought something intriguing to the role that I would like to see more of. A pre-sequel trilogy can't magically fix the massive issues and galaxy-sized plot holes in the sequels, but it can attempt to patch some of that along the way. That itself isn't a great reason to make a trilogy of movies, so the focus really needs to be on developing these characters at a critical point in their lives when they're relatively young. It's also a great opportunity to show what life in this universe looks like without an over-looming empire controlling everything. The absence of that dominant threat is a much-needed storytelling and pacing switch-up, as well as prime the audience to always feel that intended magic of Harrison Ford walking back on the bridge of the Millennium Falcon. The Thrawn trilogy has its own issues, for sure. Mostly, it gets bogged down in these boring side stories and too much politics through books 2 and 3. The overall writing and prose, while staying hyper-dedicated to Star Wars lore, is not always the strongest. If you were to actually count, I think Timothy Zahn uses sardonic or sardonically about 700 times per book. It comes up once every like 3 minutes. Once you notice it, you can't unhear it. It's so often. How did no one? How did an editor not catch it? It was baffling. It was the single thing that made me think I could probably write a book. I don't know. I hope other people out there have read this series and have identified the same issue and that I'm not being insane. Zahn also likes to reference things with the subtlety of Family Guy. Characters say things like, "I've got a bad feeling about this," about 30 times in the trilogy. Granted, the movies use it a lot too, but know when to sprinkle the salt on, Zahn. That's me being quite nitpicky, and I'm sure some people appreciate that extra layer of fan service, but more often where he takes it too far are in these cool action sequences where it's presented like, and then Luke jumped up and out of danger, just like he did over the Rancor pit, and then he grabbed the edge, like that time on the Death Star, and as he climbed up to safety, he looked out at the setting sun the same way he did growing up on Tatooine, and he whispered to himself, "I've got a bad feeling about this." Remember? It can be pretty forced. That's all I'm gonna say in terms of bad-mouthing the series. It seems like I really dug into it, but I've been sitting on those opinions for 2 years, so I really wanted to just get them out, share them with someone who might relate. But I did mostly enjoy the series. I think it sets a great template for what could come next. It does something different with the franchise, which is something the Skywalker Saga desperately needs. So for the rest of the video, I'm really going to focus on things it did well. Starting with a little summary, synopsis of each book, make sure we're all on the same page here, and start thinking about how that could be adapted to become its own canonic trilogy. The extent to which these things have been brought into the fold or pushed out of Star Wars canon is a little dicey. I don't even know where this trilogy lies anymore. I'm going to assume out. I thought about omitting this little synopsis section, but I realized probably a lot of people haven't read the books and maybe aren't interested in ever doing so, and so this is a quick way to digest that little bite-sized version. And I wanted it to be clear that I'm adapting someone else's ideas very heavily. Maybe on occasion I kind of pull in my own idea or take it in my own direction, but I think it's important to acknowledge that I'm not just creating all these characters and scenarios out of thin air. So, full spoilers ahead for the Thrawn trilogy. Here is my too long, did not read version of those books. First up, Heir to the Empire. It is 5 years after the return of the Jedi. The New Republic is actually in charge for a change, but their control of the galaxy is fragile. Grand Admiral Thrawn is a master tactician and Imperial military commander for the Galactic Empire. However, he was absent for the final battle on Endor. He emerges as an entirely new threat who focuses on cunning strategy and predicting his enemy's own plans rather than brute force or using the literal force. Thrawn is working to rally together whatever remains of the Imperial fleet. He enlists the aid of a deranged clone of a dead Jedi Master, Joruus C'baoth. I don't recall if they tell you he's a clone in this first book or not. We have other key new players, including Talon Karrde, a smuggler leader. His right hand is Mara Jade, someone who served directly under the Emperor and therefore hates Luke for taking down the Empire and is haunted by visions of the Emperor being struck down. Her and Luke are forced to work together because that's mostly why. Basically, Luke is wrapping up a mission that reminds us how sweet he is, and for the majority of the novel, he is then stranded and on the run alongside Mara. Leia is pregnant with twins, and Joruus C'baoth becomes obsessed with the idea of training them as his Jedi apprentices. He's in that special little window where he's insane enough to still think he's good and not someone fallen to the dark side. Leia and Chewbacca flee to Kashyyyk so Leia can avoid capture. She is pursued by the Noghri, an alien species who are master combatants and slaves of the Empire. They end up worshipping her, recognizing her as the offspring of Lord Vader. As much as I love the voice work throughout this series, you start to get really sick of the Noghri going, Lady Vader. It's too much. Lando and Han are on their own mission and pop in and out of the story. They are mainly trying to track down Delta Source, a spy working for Thrawn. Their main story beat is Thrawn trying to use mining ships stolen from Lando to capture more ships for his fleet. Thrawn is defeated by Rogue Squadron, and all is well. It's all pretty straightforward. That's why it works well as a novel. As the series gets more complex, it really starts to lose its footing. This begins in book 2, kinda goes off the edge in book 3. That first book had me so excited, the second one was passable, the third, a bit of a slog. Let's move on to Dark Force Rising. Such a sick Star Wars-y name. The Dark Force, aka the Katana Fleet, is this lost fleet of 200 dreadnought cruisers. It's one of the most dangerous arsenals in the galaxy, and nobody knows where it is. They thought they parked it in the Jabba lot, but must have left it somewhere between Akbar and Boba. Uncovering the Dark Force has become Thrawn's main plan. Luke is drawn to the Force powers of Joruus, and agrees to continue his training under this new master's teachings, but pretty well instantly recognizes C'baoth is insane. It's not subtle. Thrawn captures Karrde, leading to Mara Jade again needing Luke's help, so they bail on crazy C'baoth and go save Karrde. They are aware Thrawn is tracking the Katana fleet and all want to stop that from happening. A lot of time is spent trying to root out Delta Source, that mole that has infiltrated. Han and Lando meet General Garm Bel Iblis, who for all intents and purposes is their closest thing to their own Grand Admiral. If Thrawn is the head of this movie's Sith, then Bel Iblis is basically our Jedi, but he doesn't want to help. What a grouch. Leia goes to the Nogri's home planet, fulfilling a promise from the first book. Their planet is on the brink of famine, and she uncovers that was an Empire scheme to keep them subjugated. They were intentionally poisoning their crops and making it so that they were always indebted to the Empire. Upon learning this, they agree to help the New Republic. And that's good, because these little freaks are real great fighters, even if they are pretty annoying. In the end, Thrawn does find the Katana fleet. It all comes to a head and they clash at the final moments. They've tracked him down, there's some light skirmishing, they're able to destroy a few of those ships, but he gets away with the majority of the fleet. They now know he has this arsenal, but he doesn't really control the force of people to actually man that many ships. This leads into some pretty important plot points that come up in the next book, The Last Command. Everyone continues to narrowly escape the clutches of Sabaoth and Thrawn. At some point, they learn Sabaoth is a clone who went from single cell to mature Jedi in something like weeks or months, rather than the usual years or decades. And that's kind of why he went totally insane. The brain's really not meant to grow that fast. It's clear cloning is the next stage of Thrawn's plan, and Luke is trying to find his cloning facilities, the last few that remain in the galaxy from the devastation of the Clone Wars. This is tricky as Thrawn and his forces use Isilamari, which are lizards that essentially make the Force not work for anyone in close proximity. This doesn't matter to the plot as much as you think it might. I'm pretty sure these things are set up in the first book and don't really matter more than passing significance until the third. And even then, it's for like one scene. Luke does some more running and escaping. Man, is the plot of this book all over the place. They really tried to jam so much into there. I'm gonna skip like 50% of it. Leia gives birth. The smugglers, led by Card, create an alliance to combat Thrawn. It's been hinted at before, but we learn more that Mara Jade is Force sensitive. She tries to help, but people still don't trust her. Not until she helps them find Delta Source. It was like this little robot butler or something. Sabaoth wants different things than Thrawn, and their distrust grows even further. Sabaoth tries to take charge with mind control shenanigans. Garm Bel Iblis gets over himself and starts helping. Sabaoth is now openly a Dark Jedi rather than a proper Sith, and had secretly created a clone Luke using his cut-off hand, who is referred to as Luke with 2 U's. So Luke and Luke have to fight with this clone using his old lightsaber. The Dark Luke is in the novel for 2 seconds. I don't even think he speaks, so the concept felt pretty well wasted. Death, explosions, plot twists aplenty. The Nogri betray Thrawn for his forced Imperial rule, and I'm kinda into that. Luke had his big moment of conquering like the greatest evil he ever will in his life. So taking on this guy that's kind of just been like a pain, it wasn't really his battle, you know? Luke takes on Mara as an apprentice to teach her the ways of the Force. Bing bang boom, the galaxy is saved, and I just saved you about 40 hours of reading. So how about a summary of those events? Yeah, that's right, I'm summarizing a summary. I liked the first book quite a lot. The other two had pretty good ideas, they just weren't a very good read. Although I think it still was worth listening to it for that spectacular narration. Except the Nogri. I irrationally hate these characters to an extent that I never want to see them in anything again. I got very sick of hearing all those growls and hisses and grunts. Get out of here. I don't care. Replace them with an army of Jar Jar Binkses. Oh, that's too far. I promise I didn't really mean that. Here is my rundown of what I view to be the strongest elements of this Thrawn trilogy, and the parts I think would be worth adapting into these hypothetical movies. Thrawn is just so dope and so different from yet another Sith villain. He would be the main, looming threat, orchestrating everything and outmaneuvering the heroes at every turn, despite his lack of resources. The eventual idea of an evil Luke clone that makes him question his own morality and honor is great. Luke would have to assume that the clone can only exist because that darkness is inside him as well. That rattles him to his core. Mara Jade felt inconsistent and kind of poorly written. She works closely with Luke through every novel. The tension there is weak, despite the author telling us every time that their partnership is reluctant, and that she still hates him. She swears, but nothing meaningful is done with that. It's always told rather than shown. The best part of Mara was having a character who genuinely preferred the Empire. Not just out of some servitude, but because they improved the lives of some planets. Sure, she doesn't know that that betterment came with this conditional enslavement, but from her perspective, a lot of this prosperity and happiness was a direct result of the Empire. Now, the Republic is struggling and fumbling, can't control anything, they don't have a good leadership structure. Why wouldn't she think the Empire was better? She's this Force-sensitive character who worked for Palpatine under the Empire that she thrived within, and is now paired up with this guy that she thinks directly killed Palpatine and single-handedly brought down the Empire. The potential arc there writes itself. Sabaoth either needs to be cut or reworked to not be so quickly, so overtly evil. In the novels, Luke trains with him for like one evening and realizes he's a complete madman. They should form a real bond, and Luke should actually learn something from him before he turns on Luke and begins pulling him back towards the dark side. Resisting that allure will be easy for him. That's something he's already conquered in the most extreme circumstances. The dark side? Nuh-uh, not for Lukey boy. Feeling like you're still a bit of a rookie, not really sure where your place in the world is, not having the full confidence that you're the savior everyone has made you out to be, those are the threads we want to pick at. Characters like Joruus and Mara still need to exist in this story. We need characters to force Luke to question what it means to be a Jedi and what the moral choice really is. Obviously, that is critical for some major payoffs in The Last Jedi. I'm genuinely curious if people would be more okay with this cynical Luke if a seed of that was planted earlier in the franchise. Speaking of Leia and her children, she felt totally wasted. She's training to be a Jedi, and instead spends the series orchestrating drawn-out bits of diplomacy and worrying about her unborn twins and hanging out with annoying lizards. With the timeline set in the sequels, it would make so much sense to have her deep in her Jedi training with Luke at this time, and still being a few years away from ever even being pregnant with Ben. Islamari and their Force-neutralizing powers were interesting, but rarely utilized. I'm glad I did the audiobook rather than having to try to come up with the pronunciation myself. I probably would have just went Islamem every time I saw the word and just kind of cruised past it. Even now that I've heard it spoken by someone else and have a pronunciation in my brain, my temptation is to just blow past that word every time. It's easy to explain their discovery coming after the events of the other movies, but how do you explain the absence in the sequel trilogy? Maybe Thrawn destroys the planet he found them on, or something as simple as that? It's a good way to explain why the all-powerful Luke Skywalker can't simply storm Thrawn's ship and blast him and his cronies all to bits with his amazing Jedi Force powers. It's important to level the playing field for any scenario where they might come toe-to-toe. And it's yet another good example of how resourceful Thrawn can be and how far ahead he's planning. But on the flip side of that, the two of them really shouldn't go head-to-head very often, because Thrawn should be planning so far ahead that he never allows those encounters to take place unless he specifically wanted them to. Everyone's favorite overused villain trope. The intentional meetup or the intentional capture. I like that we get to see more of the Wookiees, and Kashyyyk in particular. This series also showed Chewie's tech and engineering skills rather than just being the muscle. I really like the way they added to that character. Talon Card is a dope-ass name. Basically, the books just needed to have a smuggler character who is still closer to bad than good. Han and Lando are reformed, so it doesn't really work for them. It gives us some great moments with those two trying to rub elbows in the underground that they've lost touch with. The idea of Delta Source being present, this mole that is partially how Thrawn stays ahead, is solid. But I'm not sure that that should span all three movies, especially considering the result in the books was pretty underwhelming. Alright, we've outlined the source material, identified the most valuable plot points that should be carried over from the Thrawn trilogy. Now it's time to rip apart episodes 7, 8, and 9 and point out their most egregious slip-ups and plot holes. My goal is to pinpoint and identify the parts of these movies I think work the least well, oftentimes just utterly broken, and attempt to patch those holes back up using these significant plot points from the novels. Through a bit of plot bridging and reverse engineering, I intend to map out some crucial plot points that I feel must make it into these proposed pre-sequels. This will likely be the most cathartic section for me, as this is where I get to attempt my actual fixes for the parts of the series that I dislike. You may not agree that all of these needed fixing. Even if you don't agree with all the things I disliked about the series, hopefully you can appreciate a bit of the process. At the end of that, I can hopefully outline my own Thrawn trilogy of movies. I mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. The Force Awakens negates the significance of the previous trilogy's victory. We go from having one empire to another. Despite the passage of time, the viewer is given zero breathing room. We need to see the average citizen living in peace and with their guards let down. Then it means something when that's taken away. Of course, a hero never rests, so we will have plenty of adventures to go. Nobody wants to see these three kicking their feet up and enjoying their success for 3 straight movies. Even independent of any larger threat, especially away from the Sith, there is still some real havoc Thrawn and his remaining forces can wreak. He could be a newly emerging threat, but I like to think that he will have been present for at least a little bit, and that Luke, Han, and Leia could be tracking down these fragmented Empire fleets while constantly being outmaneuvered by Thrawn. Maybe at the start of this trilogy, they don't even know who he is yet. They just know that they're constantly on the tail of someone. It kind of felt like the novels had Thrawn on the offensive quite a bit. I know that he's this master tactician and that he wins like every battle he's ever been a part of, but it's kind of absurd with his limited resources, and I like the idea of there being this mystery element as they're trying to figure out who this is that's seemingly rebuilding Empire forces. Seeing the last shreds of the Empire operating as this more covert, rebellion-like presence would be a fantastic way to flip it all on its head. The bad guys are the underdogs here and have instead switched to a more guerrilla style, seizing small strongholds of control when and where they can. These would be more isolated adventures for our heroes, targeting these individual threats, globetrotting, helping recover hopeless and destitute planets, with more focus on them growing as characters. There's so much room for really meaningful B storylines throughout. The final movie of this trilogy might have to establish the First Order as some small cult faction that has spun off, and that they've been hard to track but are notably building momentum. In hindsight, it's pretty stupid that The Force Awakens gave us the Empire 2.0. That's hard to build up to. Like, how crappy is the New Republic that they couldn't stop this threat from re-emerging? Their own limitations need to be well established. We can assume a lot walking into Episode 7, imagining where it all went wrong, but that's an impactful story and would be better off shown. This is an opinion I hold very strongly and feel needs to be said. An infallible, godlike Luke Skywalker is the least interesting thing these movies could have given me. He started out a stranded kid and became the savior of the galaxy, and we just have to believe that he never made a mistake again in his entire life? While Thrawn is the big bad of this series, and someone like Sabaoth is kind of a sub-boss, the true story, the main conflict here, is Luke coming to terms with his new position, what it means to be a Jedi, and dealing with this pillar that everyone has lifted him up onto. These movies would be about challenging everything he knows and seeding some doubts. There is a real character arc to be told there. We saw his hero's journey. The sequel trilogies have this fallen Luke Skywalker. We need to connect those two. We will mostly see confident, optimistic Luke, as we've never gotten to spend much time with him. But this arc can help us understand how he ended up so cynical as seen in The Last Jedi. Mara Jade can show him that there's some good to come from the Empire's rule, and that it wasn't black and white. Yes, they went about it by inarguably evil means, but there had to have been someone or some population in the entire galaxy that was technically better off. That's a really interesting conflict to raise. Sabaoth can shed subtle influences that also have Luke casting doubt. Show him being disillusioned with the Jedi and fighting to accept his new role as their teacher and leader. He's barely been a part of this for any portion of his life, and suddenly the entire future of the Jedi is in his hands? Pressure is palpable. Palpatineable? And finally, facing an evil Luke would be what really messes him up, even if it is a ridiculous trope. One of my least favorite moments in The Last Jedi was Leia turning into this Force-using Mary Poppins, and one of the worst plot points in Rise of Skywalker was the absurd prophecy that we only learn about when it suddenly becomes important. Both of these could be such cool plot points. When did Leia get that good? What are the extent of her powers? Why didn't she become a full Jedi like Luke? We maybe kind of sort of learned the odd thread from both of those potential plot points, but there was clearly no effort made to really weave it all together. These movies could so easily show Luke training Leia, and her coming into her own as a Jedi. We could also actually learn the prophecy, or a fragment of it, in the pre-sequels, showing us that despite her proficiency with the Force, she chose to give up her training. They tell us that later on, but they're missing out on some serious emotional depth. I don't want to see Leia spend 3 movies protecting her unborn baby. Adding a baby into the mix is usually where many franchises go to die, TV or otherwise. Even if Ben was born and a few years old, we'd have the same problem. We've already had the child Star Wars arc. I don't need more of that. We need Leia kicking ass as well, training and going on missions before learning that sacrifice she'll eventually need to make by foregoing her training. That could even be the major arc of her character, is turning that corner. She and everyone else already knows what a tough diplomat and badass she is, and she's moving towards a stage in her life where she wants to make room for a family. A dyad in the Force just sounds cool. That's some super Star Wars-y sounding stuff, and I'm on board with that. If that was pre-planned and was more of a central through line of that trilogy, it could have been one of the best aspects of the whole series. This only comes up in the final movie as if it were some great important thing that we should have all been aware of already. We've never heard of it before, we have no context of what that actually means or why we should care. Apparently, Rey's healing powers is an enhanced ability that comes from the dyad? I don't think that was in the movie. I read that on Wikipedia. You have to establish shit like that ahead of time, J.K. Rowling. This could be done at least once in these new movies, hinting at how powerful the dyad can be. My pitch would be to establish that Luke and Leia were a dyad in the Force, a special bond that they hold beyond being twins, something they never got to explore being torn apart at birth. They were both prodigies and greatly excel in all aspects of the Force, accomplishing basically anything either of them sets their mind to. It adds a layer to the way they were drawn to one another all their lives. But just when this is about to be fully realized, that's when Leia needs to give up her training. So not even the characters in the series fully understand it, and it's instead this little tease of what those powers might lead to. This could also be a reason to bring in Joruus C'baoth, without his motivation being his desire to train Leia's children. He instead identifies Luke and Leia's link and their abilities and wishes to influence that. Maybe there's hints that he's already a little insane, but you could make it an important part of his character that he truly snaps when Leia chooses to forego her Jedi training. He is collapsing, realizing that he's missing this once-in-a-generation potential of that dyad. Maybe this is where the cloned Luke comes from. It's a cool concept regardless, but if you want like a reason for it, it could be he cloned Luke and is attempting to clone Leia so that he can attempt to recreate a dyad through these bastardized clones. Maz teases the story of Luke's lightsaber and never pays it off. Instead, we would get that story here. Then that line becomes a fun reference for the audience rather than a failed setup. Also, they totally wasted the incredible Lupita Nyong'o as a character that provides exposition and hands Chewie a medal for no reason. We're kind of seeing her seemingly later in life, and she already knows some of these characters. It would be great to see a younger version, and because it's CGI anyways, you could even keep Lupita. Give her an important role in this trilogy, so that in the sequels, she gets a little older like the rest of the OG cast, and is simply trying to play a backseat role this time, being one of the characters who bridges the gap between these 6 movies. Outside of that main cast, A quick aside here, you could make sure to establish that Chewie and Maz get along well. You can have it as a funny scene where Chewie is separated from the group or taking place in a bar bet or something and leaves behind his medal. Then it's a sweet moment of Maz eventually earning that back for Chewie, rather than the most obvious fan service of all time. The audience can just assume that he was given a medal alongside everyone else way back when, rather than a character we barely know making this her personal mission to give Chewie a medal 50 years later. Why would anyone think that that was meaningful? It's just random. But with the plot of Luke's cut off hand and lightsaber being recovered for the sake of the evil clone, we now have a precise explanation for how that made its way back into the fold. Upon winning, Luke views the saber as having too much baggage. It was once Vader's until he turned to the dark side, and it is now closely linked to the darkest side of himself. He does not want it, and it is instead recovered by Maz. If you want to be really fun with it and patch up something that didn't bother me but I know a lot of people disliked, have Luke discard it over his shoulder in a bittersweet manner, knowing he's letting go of something very important. Then, when he repeats this action in The Last Jedi, rather than him callously disregarding the history of the Jedi, there's a sliver of that, then you're showing us that extra layer, where he feels he's already made this decision a long time ago. It carries too many bad memories, and he's kind of pissed that it was brought back to him. And finally, it incidentally adds even more symbolism to it, as it makes its way to Rey, only for her to have her own conflict with the dark side. And this seemingly cursed lightsaber is finally redeemed when wielded by Ben Solo at a crucial point in his own final redemption. This lightsaber becomes this focal object that's passed between so many characters and bears a weight and significance through every hand it passes. Rey's parents both do and don't matter, and also are terrible people. The way this story thread ping-ponged back and forth in the movies was so garbage. I wish they would have left it in The Last Jedi as them being meaningless, as that felt like a genuine, unexpected result. It's one of the movie's best uses of its many attempted subversions. But that option was taken away by The Rise of Skywalker. Maybe we could play out a storyline where Luke and Leia are confronted with the knowledge that members of the Palpatine family still exist. Maybe they choose to look past it. They want to dispel the notion that family is everything. Maybe a futile effort when they're two super powerful beings birthed from Darth Vader, but it feels really damaging to the Star Wars franchise that they make it out that these two families are the only things that matter in the entire universe. We could maintain optimistic Luke. I don't want to take that away from people. Yes, I like the portrayal of the character in The Last Jedi, but yeah, of course I prefer pinnacle of good Luke. I think both beliefs can be held equally, but I would rather the character remain dynamic. So here he could truly believe that there is more to the Force than simply the Skywalkers and the Palpatines. Maybe he encourages others to take his name as a mantle and to reinforce that the name and bloodline is not necessarily what has power. Heck, you could even do an inverse of that, where former slaves or other discarded citizens start taking up that name as a sign of respect and freedom. That could actually add to the eventual meaning of Rise of Skywalker, as it's not only applying to Rey. It's more about Luke's larger-than-life legacy, allowing us to emphasize the idea introduced through the Broom Kid in The Last Jedi, that anyone can be a hero. So yes, Rey's parents were Palpatines, but the name is made powerless through the people's choice to not give it power. This adds a new dimension to Kylo's claim that Rey's parents were nothing. He either never knew the truth and was manipulating her, or is choosing to squash the legacy of the Palpatines. How about Lando's weird line with that new minor character where it's unclear if he's hinting at being her dad or if he maybe wants to bang her? Yeah, maybe lay some groundwork here? Anything. I don't care. Just please, make this exchange less awkward through any means necessary. Lando is fairly important to the Thrawn trilogy novels. Surely there will be an opportunity to drop in a hint of this during his screen time. Palpatine returning is so sudden, inexplicable, and just awful. The teeniest bit of groundwork for that could be laid out here, even through the briefest of mentions. It needs just a seed. This trilogy could be sure to include cloning to let us know that far-off potential still exists in this galaxy. Side note, the Katana Fleet storyline could be reworked or even used as a springboard to tease the arsenal Palpatine eventually returns with. Everything surrounding his return was so thrown together that it becomes kind of hard to retcon, but they could at least pay it some mind. The Knights of Ren were a total waste. I know that where this name comes from has been addressed through some of the extended lore, but since they never really bothered to do anything with that in the movies, I view the opportunity there as kind of wide open. Make it so that he was trained by them and earned the name Ren through them. Give them a role to play in these other films, showing that they are a multi-generational group of warrior elites that have their own history, legacy, and renown. You could even make it that they started off good, and at some point they were either corrupted by or alongside Ben. That could be interesting. If you really want to go for it, make it so that their leader is the only one with the name Ren. Introduce us to Bob Ren, or whatever we're gonna call him, the best of the Knights of Ren. In the time since these new movies, Kylo earned the right to be called Kylo Ren as he took command. Then when we meet him all those years later, there would be this cool oh shit moment where we know instantly that he is strong enough to have earned his place as the best among them. This would also explain how he's able to so easily one-man them in the final movie. He has always been the best of the best, and we knew that right from when we first met him. Those are all the plot points that I took issue with that I feel still have potential to be repaired or expanded upon. I honestly think those small inclusions would make a world of difference to those sequels. It doesn't fix the fact that in some ways those movies are broken to their core, but I feel it does a fair job patching inconsistencies, providing setup for nonsense payoffs, and bridging gaps that previously felt too far. How about some of the other major issues with the sequels? I sure didn't cover all of them. Here are a few that I vaguely see how they could be fixed, but the answers to these feel less clear to me. Maybe it would be a great opportunity in the comments to kind of work through these together. Maybe you didn't take issue with them at all, but I thought these were bad enough that people would probably want to contribute. I know people dislike how unceremoniously Snoke was killed, but I am totally into that. I don't need some expanded backstory. It was a mystery that we simply never got to solve. Cut short when we least expected it. Keep that as is. But while we're on the subject of unceremonious deaths, Captain Phasma was obviously made to sell toys and did nothing. Make her a minor threat in an earlier movie, maybe with a different outfit, maybe a different title, but flesh out Phasma the teeniest bit. Her death would still be lame and unceremonious, but at least she would feel like a cameo in the sequels rather than a wasted opportunity. There's no need to kill off two seemingly major characters with so little mind given. It worked once with Snoke, and just seemed like a joke with her. Suddenly giving Poe a backstory like Han, turning him into a spice runner and some bad guy turned good, was totally unnecessary. We already have a Han Solo. You don't need to give that to us twice. Either give us a younger Poe that we meet when he is still a reckless kid, maybe just briefly, or instead give us a tiny peek at what this spice running entails. Maybe when Han and Lando are infiltrating the underground themselves, they encounter one of these outfits. But this might just be one of the stupid choices of Rise of Skywalker that simply can't really be undone or added to. Rey's final yellow lightsaber moment is so stupid. Maybe we could add some context to yellow lightsabers, what they mean or represent, maybe why they're uncommon or why we haven't seen one before, maybe a history lesson of some master Jedi that connects to Rey on like a personality level who was most well known for a yellow lightsaber, or instead it could be this entirely atypical thing that only exists because she built her saber using some obscure mineral off Jakku, something that makes it more linked to her, but that still does not fix the fact that they firmly established that she fights best with a two-handed weapon. Yet they didn't finally give a good guy a Darth Maul-style double lightsaber? Why not? A huge part of Luke's story was growing up alone and isolated on Tatooine, something Rey can relate deeply to. So I get that we're bringing the series full circle and giving a send-off for Luke and Leia. But the end cannot simply be an end for Luke. It needs to simultaneously feel like a beginning for Rey. I mean, they kind of attempted that, but I think a better version of that could have been her surrounded by her friends, reborn, and representing the way that anyone can rise above where they started, and fulfilling Luke's own wildest dream. Maybe they just do a Lucas-style edit to the end of this garbage movie, adding in a few characters there with her, and completely cutting the line where she calls herself Rey Skywalker. I don't care, deep fake in something else. Insert, I don't know, some shitty Jar Jar Binks line or something. The tracking knife to find the Death Star was so stupid, so ridiculous, so infuriating. I don't know if that can be explained. Finding it was happenstance. Standing in the correct place, a fluke. Everything remaining the correct shape over time to be solved in this moment was nonsense. But maybe it's one of two? The other one could be used in these new movies to help locate the Dark Force, that lost Empire fleet. Just to establish that these locator knives are a thing that maybe someone has heard of at some point? Maybe make an offhanded comment that these are traditional of some blah blah blah, or that this is one of a set of 4 and each of them are tied to some long I don't care. Something. I hate that stupid knife. I hate that poorly conceived attempt at some higher level Da Vinci Code mystery that clearly no one gave two shits about. And Finn is utterly wasted. Sorry, I cannot fix that. A reformed stormtrooper was such an interesting entry point for a character. His relationship with Poe was so endearing. John Boyega is a powerhouse actor and obviously gave this role his all. He was given zero arc or a meaningful role to play in these movies, and that will forever unfixably and almost entirely be J.J. Abrams' fault. Maybe they're both to blame, but I'm never really gonna forgive that one, and unfortunately, you can't really add to it. This is going to be written very broadly. I've already established a lot of the specific plot beats that would need to be hit in that previous section. So I'm not going to spend endless hours mapping out an entire script here. There's potentially 100 different ways each one of those could be incorporated. That's sort of the beauty of the freedom of adding this additional trilogy. Sure, you're kind of walled in by movies on either side, but it's a pretty substantial chunk of time left to fill in. I'm gonna change some things up pretty majorly from the Thrawn novels. They weren't perfect, and they obviously were never made with this eventual sequel movie trilogy in mind. So I'm gonna cut, alter, move things all over the place. Whatever, it's my video, I get to do that. Let's start by mapping out that first movie, Heir to the Empire. I would keep that title. It carries some really cool implications, and like I said before, it's so Star Wars-y. Is Thrawn the heir? Luke? The citizens of the entire galaxy who are now inheriting the chaos from the fallout of the Empire? It's a really thought-provoking, expansive title. Han, Leia, and Chewie are teamed up. We honestly just need to see more of Han and Leia together. They are tasked with tracking down Talon Karrde, banking on Han's smuggler days to assess the situation. This traces back to the threat of Thrawn and establishes that he will be a major threat for the next 2 movies. Luke is on his own, following up on either a lead or some instinct from the Force that has directed him to Joruus C'baoth. They're pulled too remote from the Republic, creating this power vacuum. This could be the emergence of Delta Source. They weren't able to monitor carefully to stop a mole from infiltrating, and it's where we start to see a fragmentation of their seat of power. Their Jedi are MIA, half of them are out there trying to keep up with this guy who's outmaneuvering them. It would be Thrawn. We'll reveal that at some point, and then the rest are left dealing with a mole. Luke is intercepted by Mara Jade, who is initially an enemy-only, hell-bent on killing Luke. She learns he is tracking a new Jedi Master, and she sees this as an opportunity to take something from Luke. She follows along and toes the line of friend and foe. I want her to serve a role like Killmonger in Black Panther. There are many villain characters like this, that's just a nice recent one to point to, showing Luke that there was some good that came from the Empire, and that some people were better off with their leadership. Luke has to show her that sacrificing their freedom was never worth that fragile security, wearing her down over time. But in the process, Luke has to at least a little bit come around to her perspective. Just a hint. Mara will learn she is Force sensitive, and they learn together that there are other Force sensitive people out there, but most are very limited and without Jedi potential. They meet Sabaoth, and in the third act, he starts pushing his more sinister credo. It is clear that Sabaoth wants Leia as well, bringing together their supposed dyad, and to usher in a new lineage of Jedi. His insanity becomes more apparent, and with Mara being a novice, they have to flee before they are overwhelmed. She may not be on Luke's side, but he won't let her fall victim to this corrupt Jedi Master. Preserving the forces of good and pushing people who are on the fence towards good is kind of his thing. There will be at least one major skirmish with Thrawn, where they narrowly escape, maybe only learning after the fact what his real goal was, and that he succeeded, crippling their forces in some small way while making off with some additional resources. You could even have it that the audience knows this and the characters don't, leading into a great setup for the following film. On to the second movie, Dark Force Rising. Again, I'm gonna keep the title. I like that it works for both the Katana fleet and the indication that there is a dark side of the Force, maybe something other than the Sith. In the novels, Sabaoth is never referred to as a Sith, but instead as a Dark Jedi. What does that mean? What could that entail? What implications are there? Maybe we also see those negative influences growing in Mara as her Force powers develop. So again, it would hopefully work on multiple levels. Han and Lando team back up and split off to dig deeper into the smuggler's world. Their main goal will be rooting out Delta Source, while also contesting with light raids from Thrawn, constantly keeping them on their toes. Luke and Leia now pair off instead, and we can see glimpses of her Jedi training, something that's been really absent from these movies. They know they are stronger together, and Luke wants to make sure they are able to protect one another from Sabaoth, even if they don't use words like dyad themselves. Plus, this swap just gives us a chance to flesh out more of these paired relationships. At some point, Mara tags along, maybe Luke is encouraging her to start some new training as well, and both he and Leia get along well enough with her. Luke is increasingly falling in line with Mara's worldview, but Leia is pulling further away. Luke wants to be a passive force of good, while Leia is afraid of losing the Republic's galactic control, and fearing they will become no better than the Empire that they fought to destroy. Sabaoth's influence seeds further doubts, both on Mara's potential for good, and whether or not they still hold the moral higher ground. As Luke and Leia are struggling, Mara is pushed aside straight into the arms of Sabaoth. Luke could see this as an early failing in his abilities as a mentor. There is a major space battle as Thrawn scatters their fleets. He has a cool plan in the books where he tricks everyone into thinking he can blast through their shields. I'd like to see that plot point play out to cause chaos and allow him to make off with most of the Katana fleet. We should probably learn late in this movie that Sabaoth is in fact a clone and that Thrawn has access to Imperial cloning tech. Again, we're leaving off on a note where Thrawn kind of has the upper hand, and we're setting up the next plot point of how his plans will unfold next. Because this is the end of the second of 3 movies, it should be a pretty devastating loss for the heroes. The whole rope-a-dope isn't very fun when it seems like the heroes are really skating through it, so this is their low point, which will lead us into the third movie, of which maybe I named a little too on the nose. We can discuss further. I'm gonna title this one The Fall of Hope. I dislike the finality of The Last Command. It fits the books, and it's a pretty good title. I guess it could also cap off this non-Sith focused trilogy. You're signaling to the audience it's the last of these that has to do with a bunch of space battles. But we've already since had The Last Jedi, so you don't really want to ape that titling format when these movies would only be 2 apart. The Fall of Hope instead reflects the setting of one son and rise of another. Luke has completed a new arc. Leia could learn that she's pregnant. Mara Jade should probably be killed off. Thrawn and Sabaoth are defeated, but we learn that the Republic is worryingly unstable. The end point here is a real mixed bag. Maybe that title choice is a little cheesy, but it connects us back to what became the eventual retitled original film, as well as suggesting a fall at this trilogy's end, to then set up the eventual rise 3 movies later. So yeah, it's corny, but I tried to give it some thought. Plus, every current trilogy in the Star Wars franchise, which I know there's only 3 of them, but at least one per trilogy has a "the" formatted title. So there you go, this is our "the" title. Luke and Leia can argue over saving Mara, with Leia being the less trusting of the two, and should actually be the one to plant the seed that maybe not everyone can be saved. That would set up this amazing character moment of Luke almost killing her son, remembering her own words. That pause in The Last Jedi where it shows him staring, holding that lightsaber with a million things flying through his head. We can now project the idea that he's hearing Leia's voice, telling him not everyone can be good. I've always thought that was a strong moment. I would hope that adding to it in this way wins over the people who disagree with Luke's lapse of judgment and dislike that aspect of the movie. Independently, Mara sees the true depths of Sabayoth's insanity firsthand and realizes Luke was her only hope. She attempts to betray this dark Jedi, sabotage his plans, and return to Luke and Leia. Han, Luke, and Leia are teamed up throughout most of this movie. I just want an excuse to see them all together again. We've been building up their relationships through these pairings, but now it's time to have this original trio all together again. We'd all love to see it, of course we would. Thrawn has his fleet, and it is all about tracking his cloning facilities. Potentially, the three do split apart in the third act as everything comes to a head. This could be where Leia learns she's pregnant. She has to confront the prophecy of her leaving her training behind. That should definitely be a struggle, but after her time with Mara and what she knows about Sabayoth, it becomes an easier decision for her to leave that behind. She could potentially willingly sever the dyad. Instead, she can turn her focus so her and Han can work together to root out Delta Source, giving us one last bit of screen time of the two of them together as a happy couple before The Force Awakens shows us after things have already fallen apart. I don't have to see the seed planted of their marriage falling apart. Presumably that comes later when Ben turns to the dark side, so just have them be happy. We have the eventual showdown of Luke versus Clone Luke, truly breaking the last of his faith in the Jedi and the Skywalker name. Even after winning, it is obvious his spirit has broken down. That hard-fought victory of the original trilogy was short-lived, and he has a whole new weight to bear, and now, without his own mentor, it's left to fester. Lando and Chewie are together to fight it out against the most direct and worst attack from Thrawn yet. But now, the dagger would be Luke seeing Mara get killed, explaining her absence later on, but also to mirror her formative moment of thinking she sees Luke kill the Emperor. Mara could be killed by Sabayoth, but there should be a bit of dramatic irony that we saw her settle into the good side of the Force before her death, whereas Luke is left to believe she died under the dark side's influence. He will question the Jedi and his leadership in a manner fitting the way Mara spent years misunderstanding the Emperor's death. Even though we know different, this could be something that haunts him for decades to come, and that's important for his eventual character trajectory. We could have this final, crushing speech from Sabayoth, talking down to the Jedi, saying a bunch of things that Luke has maybe already been thinking himself, that they're a bunch of pious zealots who gatekeep others and hoard power for themselves. There has to be some truth to it, so even though it's coming from a madman, it's really impactful. Maybe establish the idea that great power only encourages an equal balancing evil to rise up against it. The very presence of this Master Jedi, Luke Skywalker, is encouraging others to seek out power. And the idea that power corrupts, making Luke doubt himself and fear what's coming from the other side. The amazing thing is that if Luke does learn this, then come The Last Jedi, when Kylo says much the same, we can realize that Luke implanted this idea in Ben while training him, fearing Ben's own rising power. But I do think that we need to end on optimistic Luke. Yeah, we've been squashing him down the whole movie, and it should be this triumph of how well he's held up under it all, but it's clearly been grinding him down. He'd give us one last look at the best the Jedi have to offer, that grace, skill, and compassion, but leaving it all behind somewhat jaded. Now we can look back at the salvaged saga. If you've stuck with me this long, thank you. I know this is insane. Hopefully you got something out of it. I do feel that unfortunately, even with all this endless retconning and doing these filmmakers' jobs for them by setting up payoffs that they themselves should have laid the groundwork for, there are certain aspects that simply cannot be fixed in this way. Finn and Rose are wasted characters no matter what. They both had potential, especially Finn. That should have been one of the most interesting characters of the whole franchise. A reformed stormtrooper is an amazing entry point for some incredible storytelling, and they just wrote him as a lovesick puppy who never manages to confess whatever the heck it is he keeps bringing up. Rose sacrificing herself to stop Finn from sacrificing himself, but then also they both make it out of there okay. That was a waste, and also their kiss, stupid. All of it's stupid. Like, I can't pretend The Last Jedi doesn't have flaws. The kiss and resurrection with Rey and Ben is so stupid and laughable. I literally laughed at this moment in theaters. There's also the cheap fake outs of, oh, Chewie's dead, wait, never mind. C-3PO lost his memory, oh, also never mind. Nothing to be done with any of that. I could go on. I obviously didn't lay out when, where, or how every character, new or old, will play out some of the more specific plot beats. I certainly hope my outlining didn't write me into a corner just now, but I guess some of that can be saved for a second draft. Something that's apparently new to the Star Wars writing room. Ooh, burn! So, whoever inevitably takes all my top shelf ideas here and turns it into a script, just make sure my name exists in the credits there somewhere. Star Wars is such a special, multi-generational series that it is bound to be important to fans, old and new, for many decades to come. Disney has been on record saying, we will not live to see the last Star Wars movie. In some ways, that's kind of sad and makes me want to tune out of the series entirely, but it also means there's plenty of time to right this ship. And if that's truly their ambition, then they need to start taking care of this wee little Lucas baby. As it stands, the prequels are barely tolerable. The original films are incredible enough to prop up any failures that have come since. The sequels are a mess that I may likely never watch again. And while their spin-off TV series seem to now be going deeper down the hole of committing entirely to pre-existing characters, immediately ditching the short-lived era of telling original Star Wars stories, I have to hope that will give them a window of time to maybe figure it out a little bit. Maybe they can take the time to repair this broken ship they've built. Then maybe we can grow it beyond this half-baked, incomplete series we're currently stuck with. My ideas aren't perfect. Maybe you disagree with a lot of it, have some ideas of your own. Maybe I overemphasized some problems that don't bother most people, and I disregarded others. But I did my best to include what I view as being the core issues that left me soured on the franchise. The easier approach seems to be just to disregard Rise of Skywalker, maybe that entire trilogy, and try again. But since that is never going to happen, I can stash that on the same wish list I have to replace the last season of Game of Thrones, and to give final seasons to the Santa Clarita Diet and Last Man on Earth. Things I want that I'm probably never going to see. Since I'm unlikely to get any of those, the best I can hope for is an engaging, unique, structurally sound, and important storyline through this trilogy that can smooth over some of the fragmented storytelling. This project spent a long time in the oven. It was actually a lot of fun to play around in someone else's sandbox and try to think of creative and satisfying ways to fill in the things I dislike. Headcanon is never really as satisfying as the real thing, but it was still a somewhat rewarding creative exercise. And even if you disagree with me in any number of ways, I hope I made one good point you could get on board with. Maybe you could let me know what was the best idea I managed to fold in and what was the worst. And even if you disagree with me in any number of ways, I hope it gets you thinking of what you like and dislike and want from your favorite franchises, Star Wars or otherwise. This was fun for me, but I have to hope it at least starts a conversation or gets people thinking or something that puts out some positivity in the world. I don't want the entirety of this video to be Star Wars bad, I hate it, and I want things the way I want them, fix them for me. That's totally how it's gonna come across. But I mean, I made this video for myself, and I hope it reaches beyond my own personal bubble in some positive way. I have read so many fan pitches over the years that have felt so terrible. I have to imagine thousands of people are going to hate everything I had to say in this video and include it in their own personal catalog of terrible fan pitches. It's just this hilarious, inevitable truth that even if I'm proud of how this came together, there are going to be so many people who absolutely hate it. I suppose that's what I'm opening myself up to, especially with a treasured property like Star Wars. And hopefully one person out there was just nodding along quietly the whole time. Oh, it's not bad. It's a decent idea. I could see that. I suppose that's why I'm opening myself up, especially with a treasured property like Star Wars. There's no right answer. This series is gonna outlive us all. Even if it brings out a lot of negativity out of a lot of people, I still think there's some fun to be had in there. If you disagree, I encourage you to rip it to shreds. It's an opinion, none of this is fact. The only thing I ask is that you guys keep it civil. Don't make it personal, don't take it personally, and maybe the comment section can be one of the few places on the internet to have a rational conversation about Star Wars, but I really doubt it. Not everyone's a troublemaker. You guys know who you are. Thank you to the maniacs out there who watched this entire video. Maybe in the end cards I'll link some of my other overly long things that, span more than an hour. Then you guys can glimpse even deeper into my brain. I'm at a point in this channel where I'm really trying to make videos for myself. Maybe I throw a bone to the algorithm now and again, but I'm making things I want to talk about and that I want to create, and this was somewhere high up on that list. So, thank you for indulging me. Oh, look at that. The cat left her bed like an hour ago, and now she's back for the send-off. Thanks for ruining my video continuity, Misty. And thank you to patrons of the channel, whose names will be scrolling off to the right, down in the corner there. Look at all of them. A greater day. Hopefully I'll see you again soon.